Marcus Rodriguez stepped out of his modest apartment in downtown Phoenix, the Arizona sun already beating down despite the early hour. At 34, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much, yet refused to let it break him. The slight limp in his left leg told a story he rarely shared, and the Purple Heart medal tucked away in his dresser drawer held memories that haunted his dreams. Today was supposed to be different. Today was the day he would finally visit the new Veterans Resource Center that had opened just 3 blocks from his home. After months of isolation following his medical discharge from the Army, Marcus had decided it was time to reconnect with the community that understood his struggles. The nightmares were getting worse, and the walls of his small apartment seemed to close in more each day. As he walked down Central Avenue, Marcus noticed the unusual police presence in the area. 3 squad cars were parked outside the small grocery store where he often bought his morning coffee. Yellow tape fluttered in the desert breeze, and a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, their faces etched with concern and curiosity. Marcus approached slowly, his combat instincts automatically assessing the situation. The familiar weight of anxiety settled in his chest as he observed the scene. Crowds and police activity had become triggers since his return from Afghanistan, where a roadside bomb had not only shattered his leg but fractured something deeper within his psyche. "What happened here?" he asked an elderly woman standing at the edge of the crowd. "Armed robbery," she replied, shaking her head sadly. "Happened about an hour ago. They say the guy got away on foot, heading toward the Veterans Center." Marcus felt his heart rate quicken. The description the woman provided matched his general appearance, height, and build. He was Hispanic, in his 30s, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap. As he listened to the witnesses describe the suspect to the arriving officers, a cold realization crept over him. He fit the profile almost perfectly. Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison had been on the force for 8 years, and today was already testing his patience. The armed robbery suspect had vanished into the maze of downtown streets, and the pressure from his supervisor to make an arrest was mounting. Morrison prided himself on his arrest record and wasn't about to let this one slip away. When Morrison spotted Marcus standing near the crime scene, several details immediately caught his attention. The height and build matched the suspect description, and there was something about the way the man carried himself that seemed suspicious. The baseball cap, the dark jacket despite the rising temperature, and the nervous way he kept looking around all fit the profile they were hunting. Morrison approached Marcus with the confidence of a man accustomed to being in control. He had dealt with plenty of suspects who tried to blend into crime scenes, thinking they could hide in plain sight. This appeared to be exactly that situation. "Excuse me, sir," Morrison called out, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his service weapon. "I need to speak with you." Marcus turned toward the deputy and immediately felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that combat had burned into his nervous system. The officer's aggressive posture and the way his hand hovered near his weapon triggered memories of hostile encounters in Afghanistan. His breathing became shallow, and the world seemed to narrow to a tunnel focus. "Yes, officer," Marcus managed to say, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I need you to put your hands where I can see them," Morrison ordered, his tone sharp and commanding. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He slowly raised his hands, but his mind was racing. The injustice of the situation, combined with his PTSD symptoms, created a perfect storm of emotional turmoil. He had served his country with honor, sacrificed his body and peace of mind for the freedom of others, and now he was being treated like a common criminal. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Marcus said carefully, trying to keep his voice calm despite the chaos erupting in his mind. "I live just a few blocks from here. I was walking to the Veterans Center." Morrison wasn't interested in explanations. In his experience, guilty suspects always had elaborate stories ready. The nervousness in the man's voice and the way he seemed agitated only confirmed Morrison's suspicions. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him he had found his man. "Turn around and place your hands on the wall," Morrison commanded, pointing to the brick facade of the grocery store. Marcus complied, but his hands were shaking now. The familiar walls of panic were closing in around him. The sounds of the street began to fade, replaced by the echoing memories of explosions and gunfire from a desert battlefield thousands of miles away. His chest tightened, and sweat began to bead on his forehead despite the morning coolness. "I'm a veteran," Marcus said, hoping that this information might help defuse the situation. "I served in Afghanistan. My identification is in my wallet." But Morrison interpreted this statement differently. To him, it sounded like a desperate attempt to gain sympathy or create a distraction. He had heard similar claims from suspects before, and military service didn't automatically make someone innocent. If anything, the mention of combat experience made Morrison more cautious about the potential danger this suspect might pose. "Keep quiet and don't move," Morrison ordered, beginning to pat down Marcus for weapons. The physical contact sent Marcus spiraling deeper into his PTSD episode. In his mind, he was no longer on a street in Phoenix, but back in the dusty mountains of Afghanistan, surrounded by potential threats. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and his muscles tensed involuntarily. Morrison misinterpreted these physical responses as signs of guilt and resistance. The suspect was clearly agitated and seemed to be preparing to flee or fight. Morrison's training kicked in, and he reached for his taser, convinced that the situation was about to escalate. "Sir, I need you to calm down right now," Morrison said, his voice rising with authority and tension. But Marcus was beyond calming down. The combination of the unjust accusation, the physical contact, and the aggressive tone had triggered a full-scale PTSD episode. He was lost in a maze of traumatic memories, his mind unable to distinguish between past and present, between a Phoenix street and an Afghan battlefield. The crowd that had gathered to observe the crime scene investigation was now watching a new drama unfold. Some recognized the signs of a veteran in distress and murmured their concern. Others saw only what appeared to be a suspect resisting arrest. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control, with neither Marcus nor Morrison fully understanding what was happening to the other. As Marcus struggled with his internal demons, Morrison made the decision that would change everything. Believing he was dealing with a dangerous and uncooperative suspect, he drew his taser and prepared to use it. The crowd pressed closer, some shouting warnings, others pulling out their phones to record what was about to happen. The morning sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky, casting harsh shadows on a scene that was about to become a defining moment in the lives of everyone present. What had started as a routine investigation was about to transform into something that would capture national attention and force a community to confront uncomfortable truths about how it treated its heroes. In that moment before Morrison pulled the trigger, Marcus was completely lost in his memories. He was back in the convoy that had changed his life, hearing the whistle of incoming mortars and feeling the ground shake beneath his feet. The Purple Heart he had earned for his sacrifice in that desert hellscape felt very far away from this Phoenix street, where he was about to become a victim once again. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the deep disconnects between civilian law enforcement and military veterans, between perception and reality, and between the justice system and the people it was meant to protect. What happened next would ripple far beyond this single street corner, touching the lives of families, communities, and institutions across the nation. The taser was ready, Morrison's finger was on the trigger, and Marcus was trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. The crowd held its breath as the morning that had started with such hope for Marcus transformed into something that would test everyone's understanding of justice, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service to country. The electric shock hit Marcus like a bolt of lightning, sending 50,000 volts coursing through his body. He dropped to the concrete sidewalk, his muscles convulsing uncontrollably as the taser's electrical current overwhelmed his nervous system. The crowd gasped collectively, and several people began shouting at Deputy Morrison to stop. For Marcus, the physical pain of the taser was nothing compared to the psychological trauma that was now consuming him completely. The electrical shock transported him instantly back to that devastating day in Afghanistan when an improvised explosive device had torn through his unit's convoy. The sensation of being overwhelmed, helpless, and under attack crashed over him like a tidal wave of memory. On the ground, writhing in pain, Marcus was no longer aware of his surroundings. His mind had retreated to that dusty Afghan road where his brothers in arms had fought for their lives. He could hear the screaming, smell the burning metal and flesh, feel the desert sand mixing with blood. The Purple Heart medal he had received for his injuries that day seemed to mock him now as he lay helpless on American soil. Deputy Morrison stood over Marcus, believing he had successfully subdued a dangerous suspect. The taser had done its job, and the man was down and no longer a threat. Morrison reached for his handcuffs, prepared to complete the arrest and close another case. In his mind, this was a textbook example of proper police procedure. "Stay down," Morrison shouted, though Marcus was clearly incapable of moving. "You're under arrest for armed robbery." But the crowd was becoming increasingly agitated. Several witnesses who had seen Marcus walking peacefully down the street began voicing their objections loudly. An elderly veteran named Frank Williams pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger and recognition. "That man is having a PTSD episode," Williams shouted at Morrison. "Can't you see he's a veteran in distress? He wasn't resisting arrest. He was having a flashback." Williams had served in Vietnam and recognized the signs immediately. He had seen too many good soldiers destroyed by invisible wounds that civilian authorities didn't understand or recognize. The sight of Marcus convulsing on the sidewalk brought back his own painful memories of brothers who had never truly made it home from war. Morrison looked up from his handcuffs, confused by the accusation. "How do you know he's a veteran?" he demanded. "This man matches the description of an armed robbery suspect." "I'm doing my job. Because I am one too," Williams shot back. "And I know what trauma looks like when I see it. This man needs medical help, not handcuffs." Other voices in the crowd began to join Williams. Maria Santos, a nurse who lived in the neighborhood, had also recognized the symptoms of a severe panic attack. She pushed forward, trying to get Morrison's attention. "Officer, please," she pleaded. "This man is clearly experiencing a medical emergency. Look at his breathing, look at his pupils. He's not responding to your commands because he can't. He's not here mentally." But Morrison was trained to view resistance through the lens of law enforcement protocol. Noncompliance was often a precursor to violence, and his primary concern was maintaining control of the situation. The growing crowd and their vocal criticism were making him feel defensive and more determined to follow standard procedure. As Morrison knelt to apply the handcuffs, Marcus's body suddenly went rigid. His eyes rolled back, and he began to convulse more violently. The combination of the electrical shock and the severe PTSD episode was causing his body to shut down. Foam appeared at the corners of his mouth, and his breathing became labored and irregular. "He's having a seizure," Maria Santos screamed. "You need to call an ambulance right now." The urgency in her voice finally penetrated Morrison's defensive mindset. He looked down at Marcus and saw something that made him pause. This wasn't the behavior of a criminal trying to escape. This was something else entirely, something medical and serious. Morrison keyed his radio with shaking hands. "Dispatch, I need an ambulance at my location immediately. Subject appears to be having a medical emergency." While they waited for medical help to arrive, Frank Williams continued his verbal assault on Morrison's handling of the situation. "Do you have any idea what this man might have sacrificed for this country?" he demanded. "Do you know what it's like to come home from war only to be treated like an animal on your own streets?" Morrison found himself on the defensive, trying to justify his actions to an increasingly hostile crowd. "I was following proper procedure," he insisted. The suspect matched the description, and he was acting suspiciously. Suspiciously? Williams laughed bitterly. "Walking down a public street is suspicious? Looking nervous around police officers is suspicious? Son, if that's your standard for suspicious behavior, you're going to be arresting every veteran in this city." Meanwhile, Marcus remained trapped in his traumatic memories. In his mind, he was lying wounded on that Afghan roadside, listening to his fellow soldiers call for a medic. The voices around him sounded distant and distorted, mixing with the echoes of explosions and gunfire that existed only in his memory. The ambulance arrived within minutes, followed closely by Morrison's supervisor, Sergeant Diana Chun. Chun had been a deputy for 15 years and had seen her share of controversial arrests. As she surveyed the scene, the hostile crowd, and her deputy's defensive posture told her immediately that something had gone wrong. The paramedics quickly took charge of Marcus, checking his vital signs and trying to stabilize his condition. Lead paramedic Tom Rodriguez, himself a Marine veteran, recognized the symptoms immediately. "This is PTSD-related," he told his partner quietly. "Probably triggered by the stress and the electrical shock. We need to get him to the hospital and sedated before he hurts himself." As the paramedics worked, Sergeant Chin pulled Morrison aside for a private conversation. The growing crowd and the obvious distress of the man on the ground suggested that this incident was going to require careful handling. "Walk me through what happened, Jake," Chin said, her voice calm but firm. Morrison recounted his version of events, emphasizing how Marcus had matched the suspect description and appeared nervous and uncooperative. But even as he spoke, Morrison was beginning to have doubts about his interpretation of the encounter. Chin listened carefully, then surveyed the crowd. The mix of anger and sympathy on their faces told a different story than the one Morrison was presenting. She had learned to read situations beyond the immediate facts, and this one had all the hallmarks of a tragic misunderstanding. "Did you check his identification before you tasered him?" Chin asked. Morrison's face flushed with embarrassment. "He said it was in his wallet, but I thought he might be lying or trying to distract me." Chin closed her eyes briefly, recognizing the magnitude of the mistake. Protocol required verification of identity before use of force, especially in cases where the suspect was cooperative and non-threatening. Morrison's eagerness to make an arrest had led him to skip crucial steps. As the paramedics prepared to transport Marcus to the hospital, Frank Williams approached Sergeant Chin. His anger had been replaced by a weary sadness that seemed to age him before her eyes. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "I don't know what happened here today, but I hope you understand that this man has already paid more than his share for this country. Whatever mistakes were made, I hope they can be made right." Chin nodded solemnly. She was beginning to understand that this incident was going to have repercussions far beyond a simple case of mistaken identity. The crowd was dispersing, but many were still recording with their phones, and she knew that footage of a veteran being tasered would soon be circulating on social media. As the ambulance pulled away with Marcus inside, Morrison stood alone on the sidewalk, finally beginning to comprehend the full scope of what had occurred. The man he had treated as a dangerous criminal was actually a wounded warrior who had sacrificed for his country and was now suffering the invisible wounds of that service. The real armed robbery suspect remained free, somewhere in the city, while an innocent veteran was on his way to the hospital. Morrison's career, which he had built on quick decisions and decisive action, was about to face its greatest test. The question that would haunt him in the coming days was simple. How had he gotten it so wrong? Sergeant Chin remained at the scene, taking statements from witnesses and trying to piece together the full picture. With each conversation, the tragedy of the situation became more apparent. Marcus Rodriguez was not just any veteran, but a decorated combat hero whose sacrifice had earned him one of the military's highest honors for courage under fire. The irony was devastating. The same man who had faced enemy fire to protect his fellow soldiers had been brought down by friendly fire on the streets he had sworn to defend. The morning sun continued to climb in the Arizona sky, but for everyone involved, the day had taken on a much darker tone. The Phoenix Veterans Affairs Medical Center emergency room was unusually quiet for a Thursday morning when the ambulance carrying Marcus Rodriguez arrived. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the head of the emergency psychiatric unit, was reviewing patient charts when the call came in about an incoming veteran experiencing a severe PTSD episode following a taser incident with police. Dr. Mitchell had seen too many cases like this during her 15 years treating combat veterans. The transition from military to civilian life was often more dangerous than the battlefield itself, with invisible wounds that civilian authorities rarely understood. As Marcus was wheeled into the treatment room, she could see immediately that this was a severe case. Marcus remained largely unresponsive, trapped in a dissociative state where reality and memory had become indistinguishable. His body showed the telltale marks of the taser deployment, but the psychological damage was far more concerning. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his pupils dilated, and he was muttering incoherently about incoming fire and wounded soldiers. "What's his name and service history?" Dr. Mitchell asked the paramedic as they transferred Marcus to the hospital gurney. "Marcus Rodriguez," Tom Rodriguez replied, the coincidence of their shared surname not lost on him. Witnesses at the scene said he mentioned serving in Afghanistan. One of the bystanders insisted he was a decorated veteran, but we haven't been able to confirm details. Dr. Mitchell began her examination while nurses worked to establish for access and monitor Marcus's vital signs. The physical effects of the taser were straightforward to treat, but the psychological trauma would require careful handling. She had learned that approaching PTSD patients required patience and understanding of their specific triggers. Meanwhile, back at the scene, Sergeant Chun was discovering information that made the situation increasingly problematic for the sheriff's department. Frank Williams had provided her with Marcus's address and suggested she might want to check his military records before this incident became a public relations nightmare. Chun dispatched Officer Maria Valdez to Marcus's apartment complex to speak with the building manager and any neighbors who might provide character references. What Valdez found there would change everything about how the department viewed this incident. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, the building manager, was visibly upset when she learned what had happened to Marcus. She had managed the complex for 12 years and considered Marcus one of her best tenants. He was quiet, respectful, and always paid his rent on time. More importantly, she knew about his military service and the struggles he faced. "That boy is a hero," Mrs. Vasquez told Officer Valdez, tears streaming down her face. "He saved people's lives in the war. He has nightmares sometimes, and I hear him crying at night. But he would never hurt anyone. Never." Valdez asked permission to check Marcus's apartment for any information that might help clarify the situation. Mrs. Vasquez led her to apartment 3B and used her master key to open the door. What they found inside was both heartbreaking and illuminating. The small apartment was immaculately maintained, reflecting Marcus's military discipline. The furniture was sparse, but arranged with precision. On the dresser in the bedroom, Valdez found what she was looking for: Marcus's military documents and decorations. The Purple Heart Medal sat in a place of honor, accompanied by the Bronze Star Medal, the Combat Infantry Badge, and several other commendations that spoke to Marcus's distinguished service. But it was the citation that accompanied the Purple Heart that truly revealed the magnitude of the day's mistake. The citation described how Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez had risked his own life to pull 3 wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle after their convoy was attacked by an improvised explosive device. Despite suffering severe injuries to his own leg and back, Rodriguez had made multiple trips into the danger zone, saving lives while under enemy fire. His actions had earned him not just the Purple Heart for his wounds, but recognition as a true American hero. Officer Valdez photographed the documents and immediately radioed the information back to Sergeant Chun. The implications were staggering. The man Deputy Morrison had tasered was not just any veteran, but a decorated war hero whose sacrifice had saved American lives. Chun felt her stomach drop as she received the information. This was no longer a simple case of mistaken identity, but a public relations disaster that would reflect poorly on the entire department. More importantly, it represented a fundamental failure to recognize and properly treat a veteran who had already given so much for his country. At the hospital, Dr. Mitchell was slowly making progress with Marcus. She had administered a mild sedative to help calm his nervous system while keeping him conscious enough to begin the process of reorienting him to the present. The technique required patience and skill, gradually bringing PTSD patients back from their traumatic memories to current reality. "Marcus," she said softly, using his first name to establish a personal connection. "You're safe now. You're in Phoenix, at the VA hospital. The year is 2024, and you're not in Afghanistan anymore." Marcus's eyes began to focus slightly, though he remained confused and agitated. The hospital environment, with its antiseptic smells and institutional lighting, was helping to ground him in the present rather than the past. Where am I?" Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse from the stress and dehydration. "You're at the Phoenix VA Medical Center," Dr. Mitchell replied gently. "You had an episode after an encounter with police. You're safe now, and we're going to help you through this." The mention of police caused Marcus to tense up again, but Dr. Mitchell was prepared for this reaction. "The police situation is over," she assured him. "Right now, we just need to focus on getting you feeling better." As word of Marcus's true identity and heroic service records spread through the hospital staff. The atmosphere in the emergency room changed noticeably. Nurses and doctors who had initially seen him as just another PTSD case began to understand the profound injustice of what had occurred. Dr. Mitchell made a decision that would prove crucial in the hours to come. She contacted the hospital's patient advocate, Jennifer Walsh, and requested that she immediately reach out to the local Veterans of Foreign Wars Post and the American Legion chapter. If Marcus was indeed a decorated combat veteran, he needed advocates who understood both his service and his rights. Jennifer Walsh wasted no time in making the calls. Within an hour, she had reached Commander Robert Baird Johnson of VFW Post 720, a Vietnam veteran who had spent decades fighting for veterans' rights. When she explained the situation, Johnson's reaction was immediate and forceful. A Purple Heart recipient was tasered by police for walking down the street. Johnson's voice carried the outrage of a man who had seen too many veterans mistreated by the system they had sworn to protect. This is exactly the kind of thing our organization exists to prevent. Johnson immediately began making calls of his own. He contacted the local American Legion Post, the Marine Corps League, and several other veterans organizations. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community of veterans advocates, and within 2 hours, a small army of former servicemen and women was preparing to descend on the hospital. But Johnson's most important call was to Colonel James Patterson, a retired Army officer who now served as the Regional Veterans Affairs Liaison. Patterson had connections throughout the military hierarchy and understood that this incident had the potential to become a national embarrassment for both law enforcement and the military establishment. "Bob," Patterson said after hearing the details, "this is bigger than just a local police matter. If this story goes public the way it stands now, it's going to reflect poorly on how we treat our returning warriors. I need to make some calls to see if we can get some heavy hitters involved." Patterson's first call was to Major General Patricia Williams at the Pentagon. General Williams oversaw veteran affairs for the Army and had been working to improve the transition process for returning soldiers. When she heard about Marcus's case, she immediately understood the implications. "Colonel," she said, her voice crisp with military efficiency, "I want a full report on this soldier's service record and current status within the hour. And I want to know what resources we can mobilize to ensure he gets the support he deserves." As the afternoon wore on, Marcus was slowly recovering his awareness of the present situation. Dr. Mitchell had been able to bring him fully back from his dissociative episode, though he remained emotionally fragile and confused about what had happened. "Doctor," Marcus said quietly, "I was just walking to the Veterans Center. I don't understand why the police officer thought I had done something wrong." Dr. Mitchell chose her words carefully. "Sometimes there are misunderstandings, Marcus. What's important now is that you're safe and getting the help you need. There are people working to make sure this situation is handled properly." What Marcus didn't know was that those people were already mobilizing in ways that would soon transform his personal tragedy into a catalyst for broader change. The wheels of military and veteran advocacy networks had been set in motion, and they were rolling with the unstoppable force of righteous indignation. Outside the hospital, the first Veterans Organization representatives were beginning to arrive. Commander Johnson had driven directly from his office, still wearing his VFW uniform, and carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and advocacy resources. He was followed shortly by representatives from 3 other organizations, all demanding answers and accountability. The story was about to shift from a local police incident to a national conversation about how America treats its heroes. The first sign that this incident had attracted high-level attention came at exactly 3:47 p.m. when 3 black SUVs with government plates pulled up to the Phoenix Veterans Affairs Medical Center. Commander Johnson was in the lobby speaking with hospital administrators when he noticed the sudden increase in security personnel and the arrival of individuals in military dress uniforms. Major General Patricia Williams stepped out of the lead vehicle, her uniform crisp despite the long flight from Washington. She was accompanied by Colonel Patterson, Sergeant Major Michael Thompson from the Pentagon's Veterans Affairs Division, and 2 Army legal advocates. Their presence immediately elevated the situation from a local incident to a matter of national military concern. Dr. Mitchell was preparing Marcus's discharge paperwork when the hospital administrator approached her with an unusual request. "Doctor, we have some very high-ranking military officials here who would like to speak with Mr. Rodriguez. They're requesting a few minutes of your time first to understand his current condition." In the hospital conference room, General Williams listened intently as Dr. Mitchell explained Marcus's psychological state and the treatment he had received. The general's expression grew increasingly grim as she learned the full details of how a decorated combat veteran had been treated by civilian law enforcement. "Doctor," General Williams said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command, "I need you to understand that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is not just any veteran. His actions in Afghanistan saved the lives of 3 soldiers who went on to continue serving their country. One of them is now a lieutenant colonel. Another is a sergeant major training new recruits. The third is a military chaplain. The ripple effects of his heroism are still spreading through our military family." Meanwhile, in the sheriff's department, Sergeant Chun was dealing with her own crisis. The revelation of Marcus's military service and decorations had reached Sheriff David Martinez, who immediately understood that his department was facing a potential public relations catastrophe. Sheriff Martinez had served in the Marines before beginning his law enforcement career, and the idea that one of his deputies had tasered a Purple Heart recipient made him physically sick. He called an immediate meeting with Chun, Morrison, and the department's public affairs officer. "Tell me exactly how we got here," Martinez demanded, his voice tight with controlled anger. Morrison, looking pale and shaken, recounted the morning's events once again. With each detail, the sheriff's expression grew darker. The procedural failures were mounting. Failure to properly verify identity, failure to recognize signs of PTSD, failure to de-escalate a situation involving a clearly distressed individual. "Deputy Morrison," the sheriff said finally, "you are suspended pending a full investigation. I want you to understand that this is not just about your career, but about the trust between our department and the community we serve. You may have just destroyed years of community relations work." Back at the hospital, General Williams was preparing to meet with Marcus personally. This was highly unusual. Generals rarely involve themselves in individual cases, but the symbolic importance of this situation demanded the highest level of attention. Commander Johnson was invited to join the meeting, representing the civilian veterans advocacy community. As they approached Marcus's room, Johnson briefed the general on what he had learned about the local veteran population and their relationship with law enforcement. "General," Johnson said quietly, "this isn't an isolated incident. We've had increasing reports of veterans having negative encounters with police who don't understand PTSD or recognize the signs of service-related trauma. Marcus's case is just the one that finally got the attention it deserves." Marcus was sitting up in bed, much more alert than he had been earlier, but still fragile and confused about why so many important people were suddenly interested in his situation. When General Williams entered the room, he instinctively began to stand, but she gestured for him to remain seated. "At ease, soldier," she said, her voice warm but carrying unmistakable authority. "I'm General Williams from the Pentagon. I came here personally to check on your welfare and to make sure you understand that your country has not forgotten your service or your sacrifice." Marcus stared at the general in bewilderment. "Ma'am, I don't understand. Why are you here? I was just walking to the Veterans Center when the police officer thought I was someone else." General Williams pulled a chair next to Marcus's bed and sat down, a gesture that surprised everyone in the room. Generals don't typically sit with individual soldiers, but this was a moment that called for human connection rather than military protocol. "Marcus," she said, using his first name deliberately, "what happened to you today was wrong. It was a failure of the system that should protect and honor veterans like you. But I want you to know that we're going to make sure this never happens to another veteran, and we're going to make sure you get the support you deserve." As they spoke, news crews were beginning to gather outside the hospital. Word of the incident had leaked to the media, and the combination of a decorated veteran being tasered and the arrival of Pentagon officials had created a story too compelling for journalists to ignore. Inside the sheriff's department, Public Affairs Officer Lisa Chun was fielding increasingly aggressive calls from reporters. The department's initial no-comment response was only fueling more speculation and interest. Sheriff Martinez made the decision to get ahead of the story by scheduling a press conference for 6 p.m. But the veterans organizations had their own plans. Commander Johnson had coordinated with representatives from 8 different veterans groups to hold their own press conference at 5 p.m., 1 hour before the sheriff's department. They wanted to ensure that Marcus's story was told from the perspective of those who understood his service and sacrifice. At the hospital, General Williams was discussing Marcus's future with the medical team. His PTSD symptoms had been exacerbated by the day's trauma, and he would need intensive support to recover. But beyond the immediate medical needs, there were questions about his long-term care and support. "Marcus," the general said, "I want you to know that the Army takes care of its own. We're going to make sure you have access to the best possible treatment for your PTSD, and we're going to work with the veterans organizations to ensure you have the support system you need." Dr. Mitchell interjected with medical recommendations. "General, Marcus would benefit from intensive outpatient treatment at a facility that specializes in combat trauma. There are excellent programs available, but they often have waiting lists." "Not anymore," General Williams replied firmly. "I'll personally ensure that Marcus has immediate access to whatever treatment he needs. The Army failed him once by not providing adequate transition support when he was discharged. We won't fail him again." Outside, Commander Johnson was preparing for the press conference that would bring national attention to Marcus's story. He had coordinated with veterans' rights attorneys who were already discussing potential legal action against the sheriff's department. The veterans' organizations had also reached out to their contacts in Congress. Senator Patricia Wilson, chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, had already issued a statement calling for a full investigation into the incident and broader reforms in how law enforcement officers are trained to interact with veterans. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus began to understand the magnitude of the attention his situation had attracted. The small hospital room had become the center of a national conversation about veterans' rights, police training, and the invisible wounds of war. "I just wanted to visit the Veterans Center," Marcus said quietly to General Williams. "I was trying to get help for my nightmares." The general's expression softened with understanding. "And you will get that help, soldier. But your experience today is going to help ensure that other veterans don't face the same treatment. Sometimes it takes a tragedy to create the opportunity for real change." At 5 p.m., Commander Johnson stood before a bank of news cameras and microphones, flanked by representatives from multiple veterans organizations. His opening statement was direct and powerful. Today, a decorated American hero was treated like a criminal on the streets of Phoenix. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez earned the Purple Heart for saving the lives of his fellow soldiers under enemy fire in Afghanistan. This morning, he was tasered by a police officer for the crime of walking while being a veteran. This is unacceptable, and it ends now. The press conference lasted 45 minutes, with veterans advocates detailing their plans for reform and accountability. They announced the formation of a legal defense fund for Marcus, a comprehensive review of police training protocols, and a push for federal legislation requiring law enforcement agencies to receive training on veteran issues and PTSD recognition. 1 hour later, Sheriff Martinez faced the media for his own press conference. By then, the story had already been framed by the veterans' advocates, and he found himself in the difficult position of defending the indefensible. "The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office deeply regrets the incident involving Mr. Rodriguez," Martinez began. "We have initiated a full investigation, and Deputy Morrison has been suspended pending the outcome. We are also reviewing our training protocols to ensure that our officers are better equipped to recognize and respond appropriately to individuals experiencing mental health crises." But the damage was already done. The image of a Purple Heart recipient being tasered for walking down a public street had captured the nation's imagination and outrage. Social media exploded with expressions of support for Marcus and calls for justice and reform. As evening fell over Phoenix, Marcus was finally being discharged from the hospital. General Williams had arranged for him to be transported to a secure location where he could rest and begin processing the day's events without media intrusion. Before leaving, the general had one final conversation with Marcus in private. "Son," she said, "what happened to you today was a terrible injustice. But I want you to know that your service mattered, your sacrifice was real, and your country is going to do right by you. This is my personal promise to you as both a general and a fellow American." As Marcus was escorted from the hospital by military personnel and veterans advocates, he was overwhelmed by the realization that his morning walk to seek help had somehow transformed into a national moment of reckoning. The Purple Heart he had earned through pain and sacrifice in Afghanistan had taken on new meaning on the streets of Phoenix. The story was far from over. Legal proceedings would follow, policy changes would be implemented, and Marcus would begin the long journey toward healing. But in that moment, as he left the hospital surrounded by people who understood his service and valued his sacrifice, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since returning from Afghanistan. He felt like he belonged to a community that would fight for him just as hard as he had fought for them. The morning that had started with such hope for healing had become a traumatic ordeal, but it had also sparked a movement that would help ensure other veterans would never face the same injustice. In the end, Marcus's sacrifice would save lives once again, not on a battlefield in Afghanistan, but in the communities where America's heroes returned to build their new lives.